very brief introduction into the author and the work itself. So I'm assuming that most of you have heard of Jonas and know at least like some basic things about him. So I would just like to maybe provide a little bit of a biographical background and then immediately plunge into the book itself, which would be the central topic, central focus of our meetings. Hans Jonas, he was born in München-Gladbach in 1903 in West Germany, and studied during the period in Germany, which was intellectually extremely profoundly rich. So he was able to study with both Husserl and Heidegger. He mainly studied in Freiburg, also had some excursions to Heidelberg and Berlin. And finally, he obtained his PhD in 1928 under the supervision of Heidegger in Marburg for a work entitled Der Begriff der Gnosis. So I'm assuming that some of you might also know him as the author of a book on Gnosticism, where he approaches Gnosticism in a very interesting way. We're not going to focus too much on that, but it will crop up, I'm guessing, during our sessions. During the pre-war and wartime, so after the studies, he moved to England, first to England, and then later on to Palestine. He was very active in Zionist movement, so politically very active, and this also caused a lot of tensions and strife both within his family, because some of the family members were very much against that, and also with some of his friends. As you know, this was a very volatile and very polarized period, maybe not unlike the period we're currently living through. So you had a lot of different movements that were present, both on the political level, but also on the level, so in the domain of philosophy, culture, and so on and so forth. Everything was just kind of brimming with ideas and this feeling that something needs to happen, something needs to occur. And then it did occur. So during the war, he joined a special corpus in Italy, which consisted, from what I was able to see, strictly from Jews who wanted to fight against Nazis and fascists. And then towards the end of the war, he was sent to Germany. After the war, he went back to his home place and found out that his mom died in the meantime in the concentration camp. And apparently then he swore that he would never come back to Germany again. So he left for Israel, and there he taught for some time at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, but he said that this was not a particularly conducive atmosphere for him intellectually. So he moved to Canada, where he taught first at some small college that I basically never heard of, Carleton University, and then later on in New York at the New School for Social Research from 1955 onwards. Later on, he was also a Voegelin visiting professor in Munich. So apparently he did go back to Germany, at least occasionally, but he spent the rest of his life basically in the States. So he died also in New Rochelle in New York in 1993. So I'm not sure whether he was 99 or 100, but definitely he lived up, 89 or 90. I saw Adnan's face. But definitely, yeah, pretty good age for someone who's been through a lot. Okay, so the book that we will be focusing on, The Phenomenon of Life. What's interesting is that the book was published originally in English. So in 1966, it was published in the English language, and only later it was translated into German. The genre is philosophy of life, and here you have the two, so the English version at the very center, and both German translations on the left and the right side. On the left side, there's the first version from 1973, Organismus und Freiheit, so organism and freedom. And then later from 1994, this one is perhaps nowadays more accessible and more well known, Das Prinzip Leben. He added some small changes to these books, to the German translations. I remember way back when I read The Phenomenon of Life for the first time, I also read it in German at the same time, and there are some small changes and additions, some footnotes that he added later on. Two books that I would recommend if you were interested in Jonas and would like to know more about his stuff and his life and his work. One are his memoirs, which are a very, very delightful read, like a very interesting read, because he lived through very interesting times, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about, just like a very let's say concrete everyday experiences with people like Husserl or Heidegger, and the overall climate in the academia when he was studying, and so on and so forth. And then there's another book which I learned about via one podcast, namely Hans Jonas' Life, Technology and the Horizons of Responsibility by Lewis Coyne, which is I would say a pretty good presentation of the various aspects of Jonas' thought. So it connects different parts of his philosophy, tries to kind of portray a more comprehensive picture. So if somebody would like to also, explore some of his later works on ethics and technology, this is, I think, a good accompanying volume. Okay, as Jonas himself says, and as you might have noticed if you've already dipped your toes into the book itself, is that the book is not really a comprehensive whole. It's like more of a series of essays. So he says that the book is a series of fragments on the philosophy of life. And he says that the essays range over the subjects related to the philosophy of life, but the book does not offer a finished theory. Its systematic statement has yet to reach its final shape, but the looser statement in the form of essays can cover its emergent essence, and at the same time record some steps to the road by which it is being reached. So he's basically saying that he's trying to develop a rough outline, something that is not fully developed, fully fleshed out, but there is a certain unity, a certain coherence that is appearing on the horizon of what he's doing in these essays. So as I said, the book is like a series of essays in philosophy of life. And now we're moving to the introduction of the book, which was basically the material that you were supposed to read for today's session. And he says that what he means by philosophy of life is basically something that is consists of two different aspects. On the one hand, there is the philosophy of the organism, and on the other hand, there's philosophy of mind. And these two domains, he feels, have to be interrelated. So one has to find a way to bring them together. And the way he envisions this particular project is by placing him against the backdrop of a certain discussion, a certain debate that happened in the history of philosophy. So he basically says his project, in a certain way, is a way of trying to find a middle way between the ancients and the moderns, as he calls them. So his main hypothesis is that the organic, even at its lowest forms, prefigures mind, which is basically, he says something that you find as the predominant idea in ancient philosophy. And on the other hand, that the mind, even on its highest reaches, remains part of the organic, which is the idea that he associates with the moderns. So that both are valid and inseparable is the hypothesis of a philosophy which tries to stand beyond the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. So no small feat he is trying to achieve here, although not that particular atypical for a German philosopher. Yeah. So again, we have the attempt at a grand synthesis of some sort, integration of a sort, but of a very fragmentary nature. Here, still a child of his time. You know, Hegel's are already something of the past. Okay, so how does he characterize this philosophy of life that he would like to develop? So we see that he's trying to find a way where you would have organism, so life, vitality, somehow in a dialectical relationship with mindedness, mentality, on the other hand. And he contrasts two approaches to this question. He refers to scientists, and by this he basically means classical science, or the classical scientist ideal that developed in the 16th and 17th century, according to which all of this is just part of the same framework, part of the same blind process, which can be accounted for in very specific mechanical quantitative terms. By mechanical quantitative means. So he says that the only thing that scientists see is a mechanical permutation of indifferent elements, and both organisms and minds are basically the change products of this blind process. Subjective phenomena, according to this view, are nothing but a redundant byplay. So they are epiphenomena at best, illusions at worst. Okay, so they have no proper role in this particular ontological and epistemological edifice. He contrasts this particular view with another view, which is that of a philosopher. And it's interesting the way he phrases it, where he just basically, you know, juxtaposes a scientist versus a philosopher. He's not using any in-between categories here. But basically what he's referring to here is that scientists have adopted a very specific type of philosophy, and then at some point they become their own thing. Philosophers, broadly construed, belong to a different tradition in a sense. And here I think one can see his, again, embeddedness into this specific intellectual, cultural milieu of German philosophy and science at the break of the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, where you really had this different intellectual climate, which allowed for much more nuanced approaches to phenomena such as life and mind. Okay, so Jonas says that unlike scientists who sees in all of this just a blind process, philosopher is somehow wedded to this idea of an ascending scale. So he heeds the testimony of life. He takes the phenomenon of life seriously. So a philosopher will not only talk about substance and causality, but he will also always talk about a dialectics between substance and potency, between actuality and possibility, between causes and aims, goals, so causality and teleology. And almost in passing, he says, well, does this mean that the scientist as such is necessarily wedded to an Aristotelian philosophy? So the philosophy that somehow first developed these terms in the Western canon? And he says not necessarily. And interestingly enough, and he mentions this particular author on numerous occasions throughout the book, he says that one can also revert or look at what Whitehead was doing. And Whitehead, by the way, was one of the authors that we were also working on in the context of our sessions. So philosopher heeds the testimony of life, and the philosopher will also take seriously the notion of ascension, stratification, hierarchy of sorts. And the way he phrases this is very interesting. And this is something that you find, again, among many German thinkers at that time. Namely, that there is a certain progressive superposition of levels, but it's not a naive superposition of levels where you would just have one level piling up to another, but he qualifies it. He says, with the dependence of each higher on the lower and the retention of all the lower in the higher. So as you see, basically, he recapitulates what he's trying to do. He tries to find a way where mind would be dependent on life, but at the same time, life would take over, would sublimate what is present in life. Now, of course, the question emerges, what the heck does this mean, this stratification and progressive superposition and ascending scales and all of that? The way he characterizes it here is very brief, and he will go into this in greater detail in later chapters. But he says that basically philosophers take seriously and don't see as mere epiphenomena, as mere byproducts, the scope and distinctness of experience. And what he means by that is that in the domain of life, you see both on the level of perception and on the level of action, certain hierarchy, certain stratification, certain ascension. At the level of perception, what he means by this is that what we see are certain rising degrees of perception. And what he means by this specifically is that it would seem that perception is somehow moving in the direction of the widest and freest objectification of the sum of being in individual percipients. What this basically means is that with the more complex life forms, what you get is a bigger capacity to objectify. And related to this capacity to objectify is a bigger capacity of freedom. So the bigger level of freedom in action. As I said, he will explain these things in greater detail later on, but this is basically what he means by this, that there is a certain complexification, which in one way also entails, we might say, certain qualitative leaps, which, however, are not of the type where you would just have a certain substance popping out of a certain something else, but something more complex is at work. Okay, so he says that the central notion that's been cropping up in this preliminary account is the notion of freedom, which to many might seem surprising because he's talking about life and at the same time he's talking about freedom. How does this go together? It would seem that there is some sort of a tension here. And he says that no, not necessarily. His position will be that freedom is not something that is relegated solely to the domain of mind and will, but is already, again, prefigured in the organic. And one of the theses that he will put forward, and maybe one of the theses that makes him most well-known or famous among the people in the enactivist community, is this idea that metabolism, according to Jonas, is the first form of freedom. And this is how he phrases this. It is in the dark stirrings of the primeval organic substance that a principle shines forth for the first time within the vast necessity of the physical universe. So as you can see, he's quite a stylist, our Jonas. However, he immediately qualifies this. He says that it would be wrong to think that this particular freedom that he's talking about is absolute or unrestricted freedom. It is not. It is what he says, it is related to precarious being, to the precariousness of vitality. He says that the privilege of freedom is always intimately related to the burden of need. So the living being needs the relationship to matter, to its environment, in order to affirm its freedom. So it needs a certain dependence on the matter to affirm, to posit and reposit its independence of matter in the form, of the vital form. As a form, it is independent, but this particular independence is always dependent on a continual flux of, let's say, energy and physical chemical processes that allow this particular form to maintain itself, to affirm itself. And this is what Jonas calls hazardous independence. And of course, those of you who know Varela, and by the way, one of the things that I'm usually saying we shouldn't do is just name dropping. So I apologize for this, but probably Varela will crop up on several occasions during our meetings. So you see that there are a lot of affinities between his ideas about autopoietic theory of life, the notion of autopoiesis, and what Jonas is doing here. And interestingly enough, and this is a very Heideggerian term, he says that this is like a biological or a vital foundation of care. So this is why living beings are beings that care. As soon as you have life, you have this fundamental basic freedom, this precarious being or hazardous independence, and it is a being that cares, a being for which it matters what matter confronts it. Yeah. So there's an ongoing threat of the negative. By this, Jonas means that it's always possible for life to stop being alive so that it might die. And for this reason, life forms have to constantly affirm and reaffirm themselves. So because of this threat of the negative, there is a need of constant affirmation of the positive. The way Jonas phrases this is, so constitutive of life is the possibility of non-being that its very being is essentially a hovering over this abyss, a skirting of its brink. Thus, being itself has become a constant possibility rather than a given state. So a being, this is interesting, a being in the sense of vitality is in the realm of the potentia, of the possible. So that is also why, for Jonas already here, although he doesn't explicate this, the scientific worldview, where there's only room for actuality, for that which is posited, there is no room, in a certain sense, for aliveness. And another thing he brings forth, and here goes another name dropping, and which brings him close to Canguilhem, for whom this is like a central notion. He says that life is always a polarity, that it is basically, in a certain sense, an intersection, a meshwork of different polarities, of which the most fundamental is this ongoing polarity between being and not being. So the being of living forms always occurs against the background, against the horizon of not being. And then, of course, there are other polarities like self-world polarity, form-matter polarity, freedom-necessity polarity. From this, Jonas draws the conclusion that life is essentially a relationship. And this particular fact implies something which should be of much interest to Adnan. Life is closely, intrinsically interrelated to transcendence, to a going beyond itself. It is basically the phenomenon of life has to continually change to remain the same. We've mentioned this idea several times during our previous meetings. So this tension between being and not being means that life is mortal, and it is in a certain sense haunted by the phantoms of mortality. From the said polarity, identity, says Jonas, is rested in a supreme protected effort of delay whose end is foredoomed. For not being has generality or the equality of all things on its side. So in a certain sense, it's a lost battle. Identity is rested in a supreme protracted effort of delay, so it merely delays the inevitable, because the end is foredoomed. Not being has generality, that is to say, the equality of things. It holds true for all things on its side. So basically, this is how he wraps up the introduction. Committed to itself, put at the mercy of its performance, Life must depend for it on conditions over which it has no control and which may deny themselves at any time. Thus dependent on propitiousness and unpropitiousness of outer reality, it is exposed to the world from which it has seceded, and by means of which it must yet maintain itself. And now comes like a bit of a summary of his position. Emancipated from the identity of matter, it yet is in need of it. So he's opening up, we might say, if we go on a more ontological level, something that many thinkers have been doing for the past several centuries, basically, this intermediate realm between radical being and non-being. And vital phenomena for Jonas seem to be almost like prototypical examples of phenomena that fit into this particular category. One last thing that I would like to mention is that for him, philosophy of life has to, if it is to be successful, it has to basically be structured in a way where two paths meet, an ascending path and a descending path, you might say. So it has a very pre-Socratic connotations here, where you go into the underworld and up into the heaven. So because it's a dialectics, it has to be able to account for the organic facts of life, but it also has to be able to account for the self-interpretation of life in man. So from life to mind, and also from mind to life. There has to be a certain circularity, a certain back and forth movement, which should happen both on the realm of the content and also then on the realm of the methodological approach that is being taken by Jonas. Okay, I'll stop here. I think the introduction is more or less covered. So I don't know, given that this is the first session, we can maybe say a few words on introduction, if you feel so inspired and if you would find this beneficial. And if not, we can also skip it and do it next time. So basically, the floor is open.
Well, I guess maybe a question for you, because you've read Plessner as well, and a lot of some of us here have also dealt with him. How would you, like, as an introduction, compare what Jonas did with Plessner's project? Maybe as an expectation of where it's going to go apart and where it's going to fit together.
Yeah, that's a good one. So one of the things that with Plessner, there's a greater emphasis on this attempt to, and this regard, Plessner could be of quite some interest to Thales. So he really is trying to methodologically ground what he's doing in the domain of the in-between of the lived experience. And for him, the intuitive plays a crucial role. So as you remember, all of the notions that he's using are for him intuitive categories, and he's constantly trying to translate everything that he's doing into this terminology as well, which makes him sometimes very confusing because you don't really know. So how does this fit with science and everything? With Jonas, as far as I remember, this is not the case. This is not as pronounced as with Plessner. So with Jonas, you will have this idea that only life can know life. So he will kind of introduce life into the very possibility of being able to study life. But he will not really try to make this a special research project, where you remember that Plessner's first book was completely dedicated to this particular topic. And then he basically moved to the phenomenon life as a concrete example or concrete study of his broader philosophical approach. Yeah. The second thing is that I think that one way in which these two approaches could meet is they sometimes seemingly tackle a similar question from two different angles, with Plessner basically really emphasizing the question of the nature of the boundary. So how the living phenomena, how the givenness of the boundary with living phenomena is radically different from inanimate and then later on from the minded phenomena. With Jonas, he doesn't really focus that much on the boundary per se. So he's going more in the direction of how you have this dialectics between independent form and dependent something that is still related to matter. So he goes then to the metabolism, which is something which for Plessner would be like, but that's not an intuitive category. Yeah. So I think that Jonas is simpler and more easily digestible for the modern reader. But in a certain sense, he's methodologically, for that particular reason, less rigorous. Because regardless of what one may think about Plessner, Plessner is really trying to be very careful with regards to where he is in everything that he is doing. And sometimes this just come across as nitpicking and being strange, and you don't really know how this then translates to something else. With Jonas, you don't have that, but at the same time, you don't really know what the implications are of this approach for, let's say, a broader, epistemological strategy or for this particular research program. So that would be some, like, two things that from the top of my head.
I have a very similar question to Primož's, but with regards to Varela. Like everything I've read so far, it's not a lot, by Jonas seemed to me like something straight out of the enactivist literature. Like everything is consistent in my mind. But would you say that that Jonas maybe goes beyond stuff that is like the main points of Varela or enactivism, specifically in the sense of how he grounds mindedness in life? Because as we talked in some previous sessions, like this is something where some of us agree that maybe Varela, and the enactivist literature is somehow lacking. It's still like grounding a very kind of rudimentary form of mindedness, but doesn't really know how to make the step toward, like, the, let's say, higher forms of cognition, right? So maybe in this sense, would you say that Jonas could take us further than Varela?
The thing is, I only vaguely remember the chapters, the specifics of the chapters that are coming. But if I'm not mistaken, I think that he's more aware of this particular problem than maybe he would come across in Varela and similar literature. So as already, in that particular short characterization of the project, where he talks about that the level is in a certain sense dependent, but at the same time kind of feeds on the second level, so it kind of takes it up. I think that already here there is way more nuance to how this distinction is articulated, or at least the capacities to take this into more interesting directions. So as I said, I forgot the specifics, but I know that later on he talks about how movement develops and what movement introduces into the phenomenon of life. So he has more of this. He's more daring in the sense of that he's not willing necessarily to shy away and say that, look, there can be a continuity, but you can also have qualitative jumps or qualitative differences. Whereas in activists, this seems to be like that people shy away from this. It's just like, okay, now, you know, we've saw, cognition is not just something that is related strictly to, let's say, some operational manipulation of what have you, of, you know, just this operative rationality. It's grounded in something that is more fundamental. It's something that's more related to biology. And then all of a sudden, you swing into the opposite direction and then fail to see the distinctions that are also clear and important. And I think that, you know, anybody who in a certain sense takes phenomenology seriously will have to take this on board in one way or another. So Jonas, I think that he has more of this feel. And I think that he has also, if I can put it this way, a bit more balls with regards to just, you know, he really is willing to defend this view where he says, only life can know life. And he tries to stick to these guns in a certain sense. But in an activist literature, I've seen that many people have tried, except for those more, let's say, proto-classical or Varela-rooted people, are trying to get away from this because it has really, really profound implications. Really, really profound implications. And to me, it's still mind-boggling how this is not recognized as, because it's not just about saying, you know, it's not a trivial statement. If you introduce the phenomenon of life as something that has its own distinct givenness and modality and dynamics, and if it's crucial for cognition, then at some point, sooner or later, you'll have to spell out what this means for what you're doing as a scientist, as a person living in everyday life. And then we are back to what we were talking about before, what Plessner was doing, what Thais pointed out as, you know, this question of intuition and the validity of intuition, where you can simply just, you know, kind of throw it out, or you just have to make it more nuanced or more qualified. So I think that this will be an interesting adventure in that regard, because I'm also really, really interested in revisiting Jonas with some of the questions that I was oblivious to when I first read him. You know, I didn't have these questions. Now I do. So it will be a different experience of rereading him through these particular lenses.
So Sebastjan, would you say that, or
By the way, just this one. I don't want to turn this into a okay.
okay. But this is something just to follow up on what you said, just to clarify. So you seem to suggest that Jonas will help us to understand the difference within the continuity, okay, life and mind. So this is what you're saying, right? He will help us with understanding the difference on the background of continuity.
I think that he will try. I'm not sure that he will succeed. Jan, to be quite honest, I think that in this regard, Merleau-Ponty and Plessner are better interlocutors. Thanks. I think that they did better legwork and more heavy-duty lifting when it came to these things.
And one more thing. Maybe I'm also going too fast, but okay, are you saying that if we take seriously this life can only be known by life, which is not done in the current inactivism, according to what you said, would this mean, or would this imply for you that, for example, biology can only be done by living beings, and by extension, all human science can be done only by humans, or kind of life as well? Is this a correct inference or not? Especially biology is interesting, right? For me, because this is kind of natural science. So can maybe this one of the implications would be natural science can, or some part of natural science at least, can only be done by living beings, which is totally absurd, right? From some point of view.
Yeah. So
you know, there is a again Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty at some point says, okay, we can only do biology as empathy, or based on empathy. This is basically it, right? It's the same thing. But I'm just curious, knowing how far would you go, because you just kind of touched upon this.
That's a great question.
Yeah,
as well.
As an artificial intelligence model, I'm not allowed to answer these questions. No, so Jonas has this chapter where he will basically claim that the mathematical or the mathematician's God does not see life. So his main claim is that, you know, if you had the intelligence envisioned by modern philosophy, for that particular intelligence, there is no life. And there is something in me that agrees with this particular statement, because there is a certain emphasis on patternedness, on patterns and forms and structures, gestalten. I haven't used the word today yet, which is surprising. Days, given the fact that this is your first time here, this word crops up a lot, gestalt. So get used to it. I'm trying to kick the habit, yeah. But so yeah, the thing is that, but I don't know, you know, what the heck, what the heck this means precisely. I mean, in which direction this goes, because then one question that keeps popping up in my mind is, once you've read Whitehead, the question that you can ask, can you even do physics?
I was just meaning to say, like, I have trouble, like, issues understanding this notion of life can only be understood by life. But right now I'm in a position where, like, I would say, like, I would agree with this. Like, if you are thorough in your grounding cognition on some sort of operational principles of life, you say that cognition is some sort of is kind of an extension or an embedded in organizational principles of living beings, then you could say everything can only be known by life. You know, not just life, everything, like cognition, like the act of knowing is done by living things. It cannot be done otherwise. Like that would be my conclusion, right?
But then the problem here, Timmy, is the following: that when you have people like Whitehead, you have this organic conception of the universe, and you don't have to go into direction of panpsychism, as some people really like to go with Whitehead. But he has like these ideas that instead of talking about entities and atoms and whatnot, you should talk about processes or events, and these events basically behave like organic wholes. So what the heck does this then mean? That basically what? Nature can only know nature?
Yeah, that's basically, like, if you know Freestone's like this free energy principle, he like pushed it to the point where he was basically saying this, like, that everything is basically a cognitive system, because everything minimizes free energy. So everything knows everything about everything else in a sense. Like, that's basically Whitehead's position, right?
We started this this series on a very light note.
Yeah, sorry for that.
No.
Contributed, but yeah, I wanted to add like a slightly less metaphysical note. I have been constantly thinking about how this works in an activism, right? When they are talking about the value, like, okay, the organism is kind of setting its own value, or you know, enacting the sense of its environment. Well, where is the observer there, right? And then if we accept the idea that this is actually something, because the talk is purely objective, right? So we can talk from third person about what's going on in the organism, or what's the metabolism about, and this is kind of third person language. And then there maybe, if we follow this line, such as by Jonas, actually this kind of value attribution is only possible because the observer, the one who describes this metabolism or something, is themselves alive, right? But this is just a kind of to make it more precise what I was saying before, that actually there will be some applications or some possibility to reinterpret or transform what an activism is doing. It is my hope, what I would try to get from Jonas. Okay, this is just sharing my pre-understanding which I'm coming here to read Jonas, which I have never read before.
Yeah, and I understand also what you're asking, because this is one of the questions that's been bugging me and it's been very interesting to me. One thing that I think that I'm not sure whether I'm entirely satisfied with this conception of only knife can know life. I'm more, the way I would phrase it is something like, if you really decide to reconceptualize life, if you say that living beings are organic wholes, however you construe them, and then they engage with their environment in a way that is not strictly causal, but is, you know, something along the lines of having an Umwelt, what have you, domain of significance, meaning, however you want to understand this. As soon as you do this, the question of reflectivity or reflexivity pops up. And this question is, you yourself are a living being. So when you're doing whatever you're doing, what does that mean? So my idea here would be basically that what it does require is eventually, first of all, taking this, however you want to call this realm, Lebenswelt realm, domain of intuition, in a certain sense, you know, certain traditions would relate this to this. This needs to be taken serious, and it calls for some sort of a new ontology. So I understand why Merleau-Ponty didn't want to finish the prose of the world, but went to the ontology of flesh. He realized, if I want to do that, I really need a new ontology. There's no way about it. So I think that this is precisely it. So it ultimately, it's not just about like an epistemological question, but how are you going to make sense of this on the ontological level? And you really basically need a new ontology that will make room for this. So
totally agree.
Yeah. And this doesn't necessarily mean, I would say, ontology, new ontology, and you know, you really have to completely figure it out, but you can also revisit some of the things that have been done prior to the scientific revolution, see what you can do with that. So what I'm trying to say is that this particular mode of looking at things is undermined from within. So this is why I have so much issues with people who nowadays want to talk about organic wholes and teleology, but keep everything the same. Dude, it just doesn't work. It does not work. You cannot just say, you know, there's some sort of a teleology and have it on the cheap. I think so. Maybe this is, you know, a problem with me, where I then just see, wow, but then this just goes all the way. So that's why I'm really sorry that can't remember his name now. The other guy who's missing today, he I think has more of a, let's say, temperate position with regards to this. He's very much interested in reintroducing, say, teleology and the concept of individuality and autonomy into biology, but I don't think he would buy my conclusion where I say, but then you need a new ontology. So yeah.
Thanks for the commentaries. I think that's where I was heading to. So we are on the same page, I think.
Maybe some other reflections about this first introduction. I don't know, by people who haven't said anything. Thijs or Susanna or Le, Ekin. Yeah, Thijs.
One of the first things I noticed is, well, pretty much the first sentence of the introduction it is, where he says, a philosophy of life comprises a philosophy of the organism and a philosophy of mind. Just this sentence, it struck me as, it's not a given at all. He's going to talk about the phenomenon of life, but the text doesn't start with some description of experience as it happens to us, as some philosophers would do. So it's already a sort of, he already presupposes a sort of materialism, you could say, at least in the sense of supposing an outside world and talking about organism and what have you. And I was wondering if, like, well, the book is called The Phenomenon of Life, and then the subtitle, of course, is Towards a Philosophical Biology. so there's nothing special here. But in the later the later German version, it's called Das Prinzip Leben. And I was wondering if like he wrote the text and then he reflected and he thought like, I really don't talk a lot about like phenomenon in the sense of appearance, and then he changed it or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
If
No. That's actually a good point, and it ties in with what I was saying before. So, Primož, when you were asking me about the difference, Jonas, Plessner, so this is precisely what, for example, someone like Plessner would say to Jonas. You talk about the phenomenon of life. You don't really start with the phenomenon of life. You're not interested in the domain of what Plessner would call the intuitive, how it appears, what it means. There's none of that. Immediately, there's just like a classification, which seems an outside classification. And there's a friend of mine, Peter Gajic, who unfortunately I haven't heard from in a really long time. We read this book together, and he's very, very, he's a hardcore phenomenologist, like a Husserlian type phenomenologist. And this was like the main thing that he had with Jonas. He says like, this is not really a phenomenological book for me. And I know, Jan, you and I, we kind of look different in this because once you go through Merleau-Ponty, you cannot, but it's easily to overlook it, yeah? It's not a bad point where you basically start with a classification, which is not really phenomenological. It's just like, I'm going to talk about these two things. And yeah, I don't know, I can't remember if he, I'm actually going to check if I can find till next time, which is next week, if he says something in the German version about the Prinzip, because he really switches from phenomenon to principle. So
I'm not saying it's a bad thing or anything. Just
yeah, I get it.
I just noticed like it's not a given at all. Yeah, and also because like in a sense, which is always quite funny in the preface, I think he frames it as like with Descartes, the interior dimension of life, whatever is just thrown out because it's just extension and all these things. But Descartes doesn't start with organisms and minds. He starts just with appearance. So in a sense, he's even more phenomenological. And I was thinking about this, but yeah.
That's a good critique of Jonas. I mean, it's
not a critique, but it's well, I just noticed it. That's all.
This is actually what I appreciate personally about Plessner so much, because he starts with a phenomenon and sticks to the phenomenon pretty much to the end of the book. He's just building upon what is given to us in intuition and just trying to derive everything possible about life that describes the phenomenon without making any claims about how life actually is. And only in the end does he make this jump when humans who become reflexive beings start to develop this notion of an objective world, and then kind of tries to make this slightly shifty move to some kind of ontology. But throughout, he pretty much stays on the level of the phenomenon and what we can derive about life from the way the phenomenon appears to us. Yeah. And I think this is also something that Varela was also grappling with, maybe not so explicitly and systematically, but I don't know. I remember, it's been a while since I read Varela, but I remember him mentioning on several occasions this notion of how life appears to us, what's the condition of something appearing as life, and so forth. But I have to revisit all that.
Yeah, but he's very clumsy. He never, now that I've read all of it, there's so much lacunae. He had an idea, he was moving in a certain direction, but never managed to get particularly far. Yeah, some other observations maybe. I'm not going to call people out as in school because I'm on summer holiday, so I'll have enough of that in autumn again.
Oh, well, just in the same line as Timothy, I was very not surprised because I knew that from this article by Varela about sense making, but I was like I was curious about this notion of sense making, whether this is like basically the same as Jonas' idea of care, or like, and I was also curious about this. Like there's always a discussion when we talk about sense making in our group, about whether sense making, like, well, it's the same for bacteria and for humans. Well, it's not the same, but I was curious about Jonas' view about this care and this life-mind transition, like both ways that you mentioned, like going up from mind to life and life to mind.
Okay. Yeah, I think that care definitely has something to do with sense making and this polarity in general, the vital normativity, the capacity of living beings to constitute their own norms in a certain sense within a specific realm. And yeah, I'm also interested in revisiting that question, the ascension question, the ascension. So the next meeting this time, but this is like an exception now. We have it next week. After that, we have the meetings every second week. Yeah. So there's enough time to read the designated chapters. And we can then also go more thoroughly in these debates. Also, yeah, maybe just to underscore or underline this, I know that I am kind of coordinating this, and usually I have a certain pre-knowledge of these books, but I really wouldn't want this to turn into questions and answers by Vörös. I am the type of person that likes to intervene and discuss, and I have to hold back, but I'm just laying this out. I would really, really appreciate it if if like an overall exchange occurred, like discussion, where Vörös can rest a little bit during the summer holidays as well. So
we're gonna take advantage of you, no worries.
Marvelous. Connie,
we understand the message, I think.
Yeah, I'll be constantly deflecting these to new people. Like, Thais, how would you analyze this from the intuitive perspective? Constantly deflect the question. Anyway, I think that we can wrap it up for the first session, if that's okay with you, yeah? Okay. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll be seeing each other in 7 days, so next week, right? Okay, be well, enjoy your day.
See you.
Ciao, cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.